back to economics a bit, can I ask you about Corbyn's income tax rate? I mean, is he going for a top rate of 60% now?
No, 50. As far as I'm aware, he said 50 is what he would take it back to, and he'd consider 60. But again, it's one of those things that I don't think that's his biggest issue. I don't think that's his biggest focus point. I don't think it's necessarily that bothered about tax levels. I think it's obvious his biggest issue is to properly try and take on this evasion and avoidance, which are obviously two separate things, issues that's going on there. So it doesn't necessarily matter how much taxing people if you aren't getting any of it. So in terms of taxation, I don't think that he would massively change the taxation percentage of income tax.
But what is he proposing to change it to?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the only thing that he would change is 50% top rate of tax. But
So he wants to have 50%.
Yeah, back from 45 to 50. Yeah,
because historically making the tax rate higher on the top 1% has brought in less tax.
Okay. I mean, have you got anything on that?
1 second.
Yeah, but I don't think that he's. I mean, it's something he might do. I don't think it's going to be the biggest bit of his.
So that's from HMRC data, and obviously you've got the 70s where you had, kind of a 95% mental tax, and you're getting an 11% from the top 1%, and then I think by the late 80s it's down to 60%, and then when by the 90s when Lawson had changed it from 60 to 40%, you can obviously see that tax yield from the top 1% is going up.
See, the issue with this is I'm not blaming you for this, but this is really weirdly selective data. They seem to pick 2 years at random intervals, and I would suspect that isn't a very balanced picture of how the top rate of tax equates to e-tax income. But I get your point. I don't think that he's going to focus much on taxing the rich.
But I don't. Why is he talking about raising income tax rates then? Because even if you call it selective data, if you take data from the late 70s where we had a much higher income tax rate for the top 1%, and then data from 08-09 where it was 40%, I mean we've doubled the tax take from them. So why would you want to?
But there might be other reasons for that. That's the issue. As we know, the late 70s. There was a lot of economic difficulties.
Yeah, well, the other thing to say is that over that past 30 years, we became more economically viable because we expanded free markets. So, that could explain why there were more people in that 1% bracket to pay tax too.
Potentially. I mean, this is the problem with any issue that you talk about is they're just so complex, and I never think that any graph from any source, whether it's The Guardian or so I'm trying to think of a left-wing one now that I would probably use, or Positive Money or however it would be. Is necessarily going to give you much very good information. These things are really, really complex.
But I get, are you going towards? I mean, in your eyes, do you believe then that increasing the top rate of tax is a bad idea?
Well, I mean, 5% difference in the top rate of tax, so obviously just the top part of your income. I don't think we should focus too much on that. I mean, I don't know what difference it'll make to that person's life.
Besides focus, I mean, do you think it's kind of good or bad? Because it's not about what it will impact on that person's life. It's about our ability to generate taxation, to provide schools and child services, and all these good things we all want.
Yeah. Well, it's most important. Again, I think number one, most important is to have a progressive tax system where you pay based on what you earn, which is obviously what we've got to an extent now. But for me, the whole issue comes down to tax evasion, tax avoidance, which are, the figures are disputed, so I'm not going to name one because you could find a different figure based on who you ask. But obviously, it's to the tune of billions a year, and that's what he's focusing on more than changing tax rate. And I think that's a much more important discussion. That's part of the reason I like him, is because none of the other candidates seem particularly concerned with that, and I think it's something that we really need to look into because it's hardly fair for people on 30 grand a year or whatever, 20 grand or whatever to pay, 35, 40%, depending on what you earn, 30%, 25% tax.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Companies that are taking in billions a year, fiddle in their books somewhat to make it appear that they're not, and they're not paying anything. It's a ridiculous thing where these companies obviously benefit from structures and systems and education, health, that kind of thing that are paid for by taxation, that allow those companies to exist in the first place, but then don't want to contribute back to it. I know you could argue they do by hiring the people, but you can't just decide what taxes you can and can't pay. And I think,
but I mean, making sure that people pay the fair amount of tax based on the rates that we've kind of established now is a discrete kind of issue from wanting to raise those rates. When I mean, evidence tends to suggest that when you raise them, we collect less money. If that makes sense.
Well, I mean that one graph that you gave did, but it's I don't necessarily. Again, I don't think we should focus too much on a 5% change in tax for the top.
Okay.
For the top earners, just because I don't think it's the biggest part of his economic policy. His two biggest ones obviously are people's QE, which you can talk about for a bit if you want, and then the other one is obviously the chasing up the tax avoidance and evasion, which I definitely think that has to be done. I think you'd struggle to find anybody who thinks that isn't an issue.
Well, why don't you speak about why? Because that's been in the news quite a lot. But why don't you why don't you speak about the people's QE? Because I mean, that's something that has been mentioned, but I don't think most people would really follow or have followed in the news. So why don't you just ad lib on that, Robbie?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing, the people's QE, because they're basically talking about how we have this weird system now where we give banks the power to create money from thin air. So people get talking about you can't just print money, but banks do that every day. They produce money from thin air. Whether they print it literally or whether they produce it on a computer, it doesn't really matter. And then they lend it to people at interest, so they make money out of doing that. And basically, the positive money or people's QE. It's the same thing, really. It's about having a national bank, if you want to call it the Bank of England, and they print money, but they don't lend it to people. They don't sort of give it to you and then say, "We want you to give me back 1,500." It's about using that money.
So, just to clarify, does that mean that the Bank of England is coming back under government control?
It would potentially mean that, yeah. I mean, but I think that's another issue on the side is that the bank isn't as independent as it's been. From what I can understand, I don't understand that well. The economics is so complex. But it isn't. It might be independent by name, but it's obviously subject to a lot of political influence at the very least. But I wouldn't have a problem with the Bank of England or any state-owned bank, if you want to call it that, being under public control, providing there were checks in place to make sure that it was democratically accountable and that it couldn't just be to the whim of whatever government was in power at that time. So people's QE basically is a bank printing money. And instead of giving it, as we did, for example, 2008 to banks, and the money was used speculatively, because the positive money came up with this thing where they said for every pound that we printed in 2008 and gave to through quantitative easing, we only got 8p back. So we lost 92p for every pound that we gave to them. Whereas the people's QE, all this positive money, sovereign money, for every pound that you create, you're estimated to get £2.80 back. Because they're giving it to councils to build houses, and it's a way of lending money without getting into debt, basically.
Okay.
From the sound of it. This is just a different way of creating money, basically. I'm surprised it's been painted as radical as it is, because I don't think it's that crazy, actually.
Well, I mean, I firstly, what I will concede to you is that I think it's somewhat ironic that. Sorry, my throat's going somewhat. I think it's somewhat ironic that, despite governments advocating free markets, they've then injected so much kind of state support into the banking sector, as you said. I mean, that certainly shows that the state has to be part of the mix, even when it goes wrong. And I don't know how we solve that, because I'm not necessarily advocating a full free market position there, because I know there would have been a run on the banks, and I think in the circumstances I would have done the same as Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling did. But I mean, my main criticism of what you're kind of advocating, or what Corbyn's advocating, should I say, there is, I mean, a lot of people in the left kind of advocate kind of Keynesian economics, don't they?
Yeah, some do. Yeah, that whole spend money to make money kind of thing. Yeah,
yeah,
and one way of doing things.
My understanding of Keynes is that when you have a crash, you invest to get yourself out of the crash. So you increase infrastructure spending and all the stuff, which I'm sure Corbyn's for. And then, but the flip side of Keynes is that when you're having growth, you sort of cut back to give you that prudence that you've got the money there for when the hard times come. Yeah. So it's acknowledging, you have upsides and downsides to capitalism, but you've got to spend responsibly when there's growth, to be able to really inject into the market with quantitative easing when there isn't growth. And I mean, on a side point, I think that's an issue that Labour has, in that, I mean, I'm sure you agree with me, but the whole Tory argument of Labour caused the crash. I mean, I think we both agree that's rubbish, don't we?
It's just but it's obviously something that's become common knowledge without actually being true. But yeah, definitely isn't true.
And I mean, there's a good YouTube video. I don't know if you've seen it, of George Osborne saying that he'd matched Labour's spending in 2007.
I remember him saying that. I remember him backing even further deregulation of the bank. So it would have been interesting how bad it would have got if the Tories had been there.
Yeah, so I think they are hypocrites. I do agree with you there. What I would say though is, if you take, so I mean, I'll get back onto Corbyn, but to use Ed Balls as an example, I mean, he did this more in the earliest stages of last Parliament. He spoke much more about kind of Keynesian kind of infrastructure and investment projects, and I think he's wanting his cake and he's kind of, you know, trying to have his cake and eat it, and he's wanting the good side to Keynes but the bad side, because he's wanting to inject money when things go wrong. Fair enough, but the flip side is the prudence in the growth years. And, you know, even though I don't think Labour caused the crash, if you look at Labour's spending from, say, 2001 to 2007, 2008, they consistently spent at above inflation levels. So they probably should have been spending a bit more prudently to kind of get themselves ready.
I mean, part of this all comes down to the wider debate of.
I mean, do you agree? Do you agree? Do you think Labour spent too much up to 2007?
I don't really know. I mean, I think you only say that really if you want to go down the pure Keynesian economics thing. I don't really think if Labour had spent less money, the effect of the crash would have been that different. I mean, I think that the issue is a lot wider than that, and it comes down to the.
But surely, if we had more, I mean, if you've got more cash to spare, you're going to be in a better place when the hard time comes, aren't you?
Well, yeah, but obviously, if they spent less money, they'd have a budget surplus and that. But then they wouldn't use that money, so it would kind of either spend it or tax less. So even if you spend less money, it doesn't necessarily mean you have more money. Like that, I think that's a bit of a. This is where the government economics gets too complex. It's very, it's just insanely complex. Like it's just almost like you need more than even a degree to understand it properly, based on what some economists say in the when they have a chance to speak publicly. But yeah, I think it's quite. I mean, I think the problem is we have a financial system in a way within the economy that seems to be inherently unstable. I mean, you had the crashes recently, 2008. We've had other crashes throughout history, and obviously China has had something similar happen very recently. I think we need to be looking at. This is my personal view, an economy that's a lot more sustainable now. I think far too much of our economy is based on debt. So lending money and then creating debt. And speculation, so speculative investment, basically, as we can see, it's not stable because the markets regularly do crash. Greece got into a big mess for various reasons. We have as late as recently as the late 70s and then 2008 as well. So these things that are happening like once in a century, they're happening multiple times in a century. So I think we need to be looking at the economy in general, not just Corbynomics as they're calling it.
But if we kind of think that, you know, kind of economic investment and quantitative easing is best used in the kind of downturn of the economic cycle, why is Corbyn? I mean, I'm not saying we are strong growth right now, but we're probably better defined in the growth period of the cycle. Why is he wanting to use quantitative easing now to inject something? Because it doesn't seem like the appropriate time to do that.
Well, basically, I mean, if a bank, so say the government wanted to, I mean, governments borrow all the time, like regardless of, we always borrow. The Conservative government have borrowed insane amounts of money. You know, it doesn't matter how you're doing things, governments will always borrow money. It's how things work. And basically, the sovereign money or people's QE idea is that you don't. If a bank lends you money, they have to create that money. It doesn't just come from. It doesn't just sort of, they don't have it already. They create the money, and it has debt attached to it. So the idea of this whole people's QE thing is the Bank of England or whoever it is creates that money and lends it to investment projects, but it's free of debt. So you're getting that money without the debt. That seems to be the big difference to me. It's about taking the power of creating money away from banks and giving it back to sort of more of an accountable process again. That's as far as I understand it anyway. So basically, it's a way of borrowing money without getting into debt. That seems to be how I understand it.
Yep. Well, I mean, I definitely don't know everything about people's quantitative easing.
It's very complex.
I will look more into it. I mean, I've got to be honest, probably from what I've said so far, I'm not utterly convinced this is the right time for something like that. But
like I said before, again, it's even if we have growth, governments are still borrowing money. Right? You know, they will still borrow money. Yeah, and they won't be printing money. It's not like this comparison to 2008 almost isn't really relevant because they just printed insane amounts of money very quickly and just gave it to the banks. And this is it. They wouldn't create anywhere near as much money as they did. And again, it wouldn't be given in a speculative financial market kind of sense. It would be
Yep.
the Bank of England creates the money as a bank would, and then gives it to the local authority instead of the local authority borrowing the money from a bank that had to create the money in the first place. It's just a different organisation creating the money. That's the main difference.
Here's a more general question for you, Robbie. Do you feel that over the past 5 years the UK has experienced austerity?
Yeah. Obviously.
Okay. But we have we've got 1.5 trillion pounds of debt right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we started off with a crash with 500 billion pounds of debt. So
Yeah.
how is taking on an extra £1 trillion of debt kind of how are you in austerity if you take on £1 trillion of debt?
Well, again, the problem is austerity is a funny word. I mean, the better way of putting it is the government is obviously is committed to great amounts of cutting in public services.
Because the national debt rocketed under the coalition.
I know it did, yeah. But because again, they did the opposite of Keynesian economics, where you come out for a crash, and instead of investing money, they decided to. I mean, because they still borrowed loads of money. The Conservatives borrowed more money, and so the coalition.
I agree.
Borrowed more money in 3 years than Labour did in 13, and created more million. I think it was for Manchester, and that's a massive amount of the budget. That's like 30% gone, like that. And you can't. I agree with the kind of basic statement of you can't cut your way to prosperity. It's obviously they've had to borrow so much money partly because they haven't managed to get things going by cutting things. You can't. It's that whole equating household finances with the government's finances thing that's because the Conservatives have obviously got on platform by doing that, but then they've tried to do it themselves and it obviously hasn't worked. They've not met any of their own targets that they set themselves in 2010.
Yeah, no, I do in part agree with that. I mean, one of the things that I think left-wing people kind of level against the Conservatives is they say that they're quite ideologically kind of driven. I mean, do you think they're ideologically driven?
Yeah, but everybody is. I don't think that's I think you could argue the same with the left, or the liberals, or the people of the centre, or whatever. But obviously they are because I mean it was interesting. For the first 2 years, they were obviously cutting very heavily, and UK growth actually plummeted as a result of that. So they actually held off the cuts and almost reduced the austerity, if you want to put it like that, and then growth increased. And then once the growth increased again, then they went back to the cuts again, and then growth slowed down again. So it seems to me that but they didn't tell anybody about that. They tried to.
So they are kind of willing to shift their position more than
perhaps. Yeah, of course they are, but that's
because the left don't concede that, do they? They don't concede.
Oh, no, but they shifted it in policy, but they didn't shift it in presentation. So they shifted it very secretly, but then when things got better, they pretended that was because of austerity. They pretended that was because of their original program, and it wasn't. It was because they actually reneged on it, almost, whatever the word is. Went back on it.
They are sort of trying to be more pragmatic than the left, and this is one of the things I feel about Corbyn. I feel that the left doesn't want to negotiate with the centre ground, but if you look at the Conservatives, they've just really increased the minimum wage, or plan to. They've changed, like you said, they changed the tack economically within the middle of Parliament. And, they backed gay marriage. I mean, well, the higher echelons of the Conservative Party backed gay marriage. And ultimately, they were pragmatic enough to form a coalition. So, I mean, the Tories are less ideological than kind of the hard left of Labour, aren't they?
I think it depends on the people, on who it is. I don't think that's a statement that's fair to either side. Some Tories will be really ideological, some won't. Some hard left people will be incredibly ideological, others won't. I mean, I support Corbyn obviously, but I mean in a lot of areas we don't agree. I've had to sort of accept that you don't get all your own way. And I think that the left probably does compromise more than people would think. It's just that they don't maybe say that they do, they pretend that they don't. Yep. But a lot of left-wing people vote for Labour and the Lib Dems and the SNP or whoever, even though they don't. Those parties don't represent them in a lot of ways. So I think everybody compromises, to some extent. But I do definitely think that this kind of committal. I mean, even though they went back on the austerity for a year, went back to straight after, and then, like I said, publicly said, hey, things got a bit better. That's because of our austerity. Whereas anybody that's looked into it in any kind of decent way has seen that it's not worked at all. But everybody, government, it's a government, isn't it? It's sort of how it seems to go, really.
No, I think that's a very valid point. Do you want to move on to if we think Corbyn can win? I mean, as in win in 2020 if he wins the leadership there is.
Yeah. Basically, I think that it doesn't matter who you put in charge. So you could get Dan Jarvis, you could get Chucker Umunna, you could get Corbyn, you could get Cooper, Burnham, Kendall. Doesn't matter who. 2020 majority for Labour is going to be very hard for anybody because of the rise of UKIP, the SNP.
So does that mean? Sorry, does that mean you don't think Corbyn will win a majority in 2020?
It means I don't think anybody will. But if I was going to select somebody that has the best chance of doing it, I think it would be him.
So you think he's going to do? He's not going to do well, but he's going to do slightly better than the other candidates.
Yeah, that's probably the best way of putting it. But I don't think that's necessarily anything about him or the other candidates.
Okay.
The boundary changes are going to be make things very difficult for Labour because they're set to lose something like 50 seats because the boundary changes happen to be in a lot of Labour areas, and the way the seats are being redrawn is going to come out in a way that will basically mean that they'll become safe Tory seats and Labour will lose MPs automatically. So they're coming from a point of even further back than they actually are. And I just think it'd be hard for them regardless. But if you look at the reasons why Labour, let's take being left wing or whatever out of it, because I don't think most people really approach politics like that. If you look at the reasons why Labour lost,
very Owen Jones of you.
He's very Owen Jones. I hate Owen Bennett. Yeah, I think it's more. If Labour go with like Cooper, Burnham, or Kendall, obviously there are minor differences in certain policies and that kind of thing, but it's broadly quite, I would think that to most people would appear pretty much the same as 2015, and I don't see how. I don't think that they would win back many, if any, marginal Tory seats or swing seats, and I think they would risk losing. Because the problem with Labour is, talking to people that have been doing the Corbyn campaign, is that left of Labour, in terms of the involved in the party and voters, have been kind of ignored for a long time. So they've been kind of taken for granted for a long time. And that's how they feel. And I think last year was a bit of especially in Scotland, you're starting to see people saying we're not going to take it anymore, basically. And I think this is almost a pivotal moment where if Labour do carry on with a centrist, centre-right, whatever you want to call the Miliband Brown strategy, but one that appears to many people to be not different enough from the Tories.
Do you think Miliband was following a centre-right strategy?
Not in terms of if you analyse his manifesto. Well, not many people will read a manifesto. But in terms of like how he spoke, the fact that they weren't, especially in terms of the economy. If your party doesn't particularly bother to challenge properly the idea that you're overspent and doesn't argue properly the idea that cutting is the best way of doing things, then you're on a hide into nothing, aren't you? And that's the problem, is that.
But that's not what most people thought. I mean, if you walked around a town and said, was Ed Miliband centre right? I don't think you'll get many people saying he was, will you?
No, not necessarily. But I don't think that Labour lost in 2015 because they were too left wing.
I think they were perceived as too left wing.
I don't think they were. They're certainly not to me. And I think if you look in Scotland and that, I don't think it matters what wing, if you want to put it, or spectrum people see you on. It's, does this person represent me, and is this person standing up for me? And again, it was this Labour appeared again to be sort of and not representing immigration-wise, obviously, large parts of the working class, like Castleford areas of the country that vote with the UKIP a lot. In Scotland, there's a big nationalistic element there. But I think there was a big part of the Scottish felt that what Labour and Ed Miliband was saying, it wasn't particularly representative and wasn't really again, I think they took Scotland for granted. And then the young vote, a lot of young people did vote for Labour, but loads just didn't bother showing up in the first place. And I don't think that was because there wasn't enough right-wing options available.
Well, I think the SNP pushed the anti-austerity thing, but I mean, the SNP aren't to the left of Labour.
No, they're not. I know factually, but again,
they go all over the place.
How people perceive them. That's the biggest.
And I think nationalism is a big draw.
So do I, but it didn't come from nowhere.
I think the biggest thing, to be honest, mate, is the fact that Labour's neglected just putting good politicians in Scotland who run things properly in canvas, and that's why they lost, because they've just stopped campaigning in Scotland.
Yeah. Again, they felt left behind, and that's a big problem. Is that I don't think that Cooper, Burnham, or Kendall are going to make Scottish people UKIP voters.
Well, I don't think Labour's necessarily going to win Scotland back in 2020. I think it's going to take a generation to kind of win it back. And one of the things that I sort of disagree with people who back Corbyn in is they kind of, when you say, well, where are you going to win? They, you can see Scotland there. They kind of, do you know what I mean? Kind of stereotypical Corbyn supporter will say.
Yeah, I think that, let's put it a different way. If you just target middle England, and let's not beat around the bush, especially with Kendall, that is the strategy, is to target middle England. If you do that, you're not going to win over enough people to make up for the losses that you'll incur as a result of that, as we saw in 2015, I think. I think that Labour has been... I think it's a difficult task no matter who does it, but I think at least with Corbyn he's sufficiently different and is at least presenting a different way of doing things that you have a chance of winning over enough people because it's at least a different way. If you go with Kendall, Corbyn or Cooper, it's not different enough, and it's that almost tacit endorsement of what the Tories are doing, saying yeah they're right, but what we mean about it or whatever. As we saw in 2015 and 2010, people are going to go who they perceive to be better. Things like how managing the economy.
To go back to Middle England, I imagine you're speaking about swing seats there.
Yeah, and I don't really think that. I don't think that Corbyn would win over that many, but I don't think that he would win over that. I don't think the other three would either.
But I mean, if you take swing seats that voted Conservative this time, now we're acknowledging that none of the candidates are going to do particularly well in Scotland. When we get to the swing seats, I mean, do you legitimately believe that in swing seats where people switched in either 2010 or 2015 from Labour to the Conservatives, people would be more likely to send back a Labour MP in 2020 if Corbyn's leader?
No, I don't. But I don't think that more likely.
So doesn't that? But if you don't, I mean, surely one of the other candidates would have a better chance in those swing seats.
Hang on one sec. Yeah. I think that I mean one big thing is in a lot of seats that Labour lost to the Tories. The reason they lost is because they lost votes to the Greens and to UKIP. And I just don't see again how. I think you agree with me on this as well. I don't think the other three candidates have got enough about them to convince Tory voters to go back to Labour.
But I admit they're rubbish. But I mean, are you saying that? I mean, but are you saying that Corbyn has more chance than they do of winning in those swing seats?
No, but I think he's got more chance of winning over other demographics.
But if we believe, I mean, because this is the problem though, so we're believing none of them can do well in Scotland. You're conceding to me that in the swing seats, Corbyn is going to do less well than the other candidates. Now, my worry is that amongst the demographics you're talking about, he's going to stack up votes in safe Labour seats, but he's not going to get the votes where he needs them.
Well, again, you maybe could argue that, but I think if you get enough, I mean, I know that I concede that getting non-voters to vote is a thankless task, to put it mildly, but voter turnout has been generally reducing for a long time. And again, I just don't think, and I think you think this as well because you already said it, I don't think that the other three are going to win over many marginal voters. They're not enough to take many seats home. And I'm not saying that he's going to do that any better, but I think seats where they lost votes to UKIP and the Greens, for example, or seats in Scotland and that kind of thing, I think he has a chance of at least winning those seats back. Whereas I think the others, if they did win over any Middle England seats, they would at least lose other seats.
Okay, I mean, you mentioned non-voters there, Robbie. I mean, I think it's good to get people to participate in politics more, but I sort of worry when people want to build an electoral strategy on people who don't tend to vote anyway. I mean, do you think people exaggerate that in their analysis of why Corbyn can win?
Probably, but I think it's not the same thing. But a good example is, I think again a lot of people, these non-voters don't, because again they don't feel like politicians or politics particularly has anything like, doesn't matter who I vote for, my life's going to be shit anyway kind of thing. And if you look at, for example, turnout for the I'm not saying the same thing, but for example the independence election in Scotland, it went to 85%. There was a lot of excitement and people felt like it was a big thing and they were really engaged and they were part of it. And this is what I think Corbyn's strength is that he's definitely got the most sort of engagement with the general public, and I think that he would be able to almost do a Syriza in Greece, where you spend your campaign talking to people and being on the ground,
Yep.
instead of talking to people through cameras, if you get what I'm saying.
I get that. I mean, to bring another little dynamic into it, I think one of the things which has been massively overlooked in why we now have a kind of conservative majority, so to speak, is the collapse of the Lib Dems. And if the Lib Dems hadn't have collapsed, that is the reason the Tories now have majority, is that the Lib
I know,
Dems
it's
collapsed.
crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think they'll come back in 2020 though. I think we'll be. I'm not saying they'll do as well as they did before, but
Yeah.
I would expect. And this is another thing why I don't think Labour necessarily has to win a majority to be, in a government. And this is why I don't think that they have to win a majority to be in power in 2020.
Well,
I think that I imagine that Lib Dems will come back in a lot of Cornwall and that area.
yeah, because there's two sides to it. Because obviously the Southwest was sort of a heartland for them, and the fact they collapsed there gave the Tories a majority, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, I suspect a lot of the people who flipped to the Tories in kind of the Southwest did so because of the fear of the SNP. And I just think perhaps the Lib Dems won't rebound as much in 2020 as we think. Sorry, Robbie, go on.
No, honestly, mate. Sorry, I was just going to say, I don't think that they'll get I'm on about maybe them coming out with 20 seats, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, but I think the Tories will play. There's the fear of the SNP, and there's the fear of Corbyn, and particularly when Corbyn said he could work with the SNP. That is probably going to lock in a lot of those Tory switches in the Southwest.
Yeah, maybe. I think part of this is sort of where Miliband was very weak, and where I think his big weakness was. When he said, "Oh, I won't," I will not work with the SNP. People knew he was lying. Like, they knew that if it came to it, he would happily go in a coalition with them. And I think part of it is if the Conservatives, and this is where Corbyn has a good chance, is they're allowed to set the argument far too much, and then it's almost like you have to defend it.
I think Miliband was right to say that, though, don't you?
No, I think if Miliband, because he was lying, if he come out and said, if we don't have enough seats and the only way of us doing anything is an SNP coalition, then we will obviously do that.
So would you rather he'd have worked with the SNP or not?
What, than a Tory government?
Yeah.
God, yeah.
Well, you'd work with someone a party that by definition wants to destroy your country?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the Scottish getting independence would destroy my country.
Well, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland would cease to exist.
Well, yeah, maybe, but that's, I don't think that's not something that particularly concerns me personally. If Scotland as a nation, if you want to call it that, decides that they want to become an independent country, I don't really think that it's, obviously they did decide that when they had the chance, but I don't think my fear of that should influence.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. I mean, I think it's as plausible as Yorkshire becoming independent, but, that's...
Yeah, well, again, I'm not really internationalism overall anyway. I think it's a bit of a silly thing to attach too much importance to.
But I mean, we're all very mild about it, and we don't really, chest beat over here. But I know you're not a nationalist, but you're a patriot, aren't you?
What is a patriot? What's a patriot to you?
Well, you're proud of your country. You take a certain pride in saying I'm British. Yeah.
It's not really something I even think about. I don't think of myself as British much. I'm not ashamed of it, but I'm not proud of it either. It's just sort of a thing, I guess.
So you literally take no pride in being from Britain?
Well, not really. Why would it? Why would I? I mean,
because it's a web of culture and tradition, and your kind of ancestors are from here, and it's the place that shaped you and defined you, and it's got bad bits to it, and there's bits you don't like, but it's like I think George Orwell said that Britain's a family with the wrong people in charge, and whether we like it or not, this is our family. And I think it's weird that some people on the left don't want to say, you know what, I do like Britain. It's a great place to live.
Well, I'm not saying I don't like it as a place to live in terms of I don't like living here. But I wouldn't say that I'm a patriot in the sense of
if someone said, "Are you proud to be British?" I mean, you wouldn't just go, "Well, yeah."
I'd say I'm not proud or not proud. It doesn't form part of my identity. Is probably a better way of putting it. That might be a strange thing to a lot of people.
It's a very idiosyncratic thing. I think most people would find that somewhat alien.
Probably, yeah. I mean, but as you know from my views on animals and that, I'm quite comfortable taking positions that people find alien. It doesn't concern.
No, that's fair enough. But doesn't that kind of attitude in part reflect why the Corbyn camp will struggle to appeal to the majority? In that, it sort of holds views like that, where it's a bit hand-wringing about patriotism that most people just don't buy into.
Maybe, but I don't think the Corbyn camp and people in this thing. I think that I'm probably less. I'm probably less. I'm going to call it nationalistic or patriotic than most people. I certainly want our society as large to be a better place, and I think there's certainly good things about the UK as a society. But if somebody says to me, "Are you proud to be British?" I don't really think that's a thing. It's sort of taking pride in something you had very little to do with. That's a better way of putting it. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not proud of it. It's just being British is neither here nor there to me, and I don't know. I imagine that is alien to a lot of people, but national identity is something that's promoted from when you're very young. It's just something that's never really. But I mean, I'm a bit of a hypocrite with it. You know, if I'm watching sport, I would naturally want the British athlete to do well, so not pretending that I'm better than it or above it, and not at all. But it's certainly not something that I try. I try not to let that aspect take over me too much. It's probably a better way for me.
No, that's a fair point. I mean, it's not a perspective I hold myself, but I can.
No, fair enough. I'm fine with that. I
can understand that. I mean, just to sum up though, on can he win? So you've sort of acknowledged that none of them can really win in Scotland.
I think Corbyn would do the best in Scotland. It's been confirmed by SNP voters and talks to.
But you still think it's going to be difficult?
Yeah, I think that okay, I'll put it a different way. Any of the other three candidates, I don't think you'd win a single seat back in Scotland, unless the SNP really messes up in the next 5 years. I think with Corbyn, you have a chance of winning some.
Okay, but I mean, let me go on.
Maybe 5, like something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, so, you think Corbyn's going to do better than most, but still going to struggle in Scotland. You feel that in terms of non-voters, it's somewhat tricky to get people who don't vote.
I think it's best shots with young non-voters. I think it's 4 out of 10 people under the age of 25 voted. That's something that's insane, and it's obvious from the makeup of people that are volunteering, from what I can see, that are showing up at his rallies and that kind of thing, that he has the best chance of energising people that haven't voted before compared to the other three.
Okay, but then again, are there enough young people who don't vote spreading the constituencies you need to win to kind of, count when it matters?
No, not on its own. Again, it's a combination of them all, because basically you've got to try and win back some UKIP voters, try and win some Green voters, which I can say from personal experience Corbyn can do. Try and get some, because I don't think that people that voted Tory, a few of them, not all of them, but a decent enough amount, did it because they thought, in a positive way, if you get what I mean. It was more of this is the best bet, or we need to look after the economy, in kind of a sort of a resigned sort of way, like I was saying about the other candidates. And I think you'd be surprised, and I think we will be surprised. I'm not saying that he would do well in the marginal swing seats. I think that Labour would struggle regardless of who they get, but I don't think he wouldn't win over anybody that's voted Conservative. I think he could win some seats. But yeah,
I guess my thing summing up is, so we said Scotland's going to be difficult. Non-voters, perhaps not necessarily. Perhaps the Lib Dems are the only ones who can succeed in the southwest. And then on swing seats, you've admitted that you think Corbyn will probably do not as well as the others. I mean, that to me isn't necessarily a compelling case that Corbyn is the better out of the 4 candidates.
Well, I think a better thing is then, I'll turn it around then. Give me a compelling case why any of the 3 candidates would do better.
I think that out of the 4, even though I'm more close to Len with Liz Kendall, I think Yvette Cooper might do better, in the sense that what I think Labour should be kind of shooting for now is to get the Tories into a minority government position in 2020 and to build to 2025. And I think Yvette Cooper would be in a better position to do that than Jeremy. And there's other reasons for that as well. I don't think Jeremy's necessarily going to hold the parliamentary party together. I think if you've got someone who's consistently voted against the kind of his own party's whip, why should anyone support him if they disagree with him? Why should anyone vote with their party if he's leader?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I do think I 100% agree that him holding together the PLP, if you want to call it that, will be very hard. But I think that.
But why would you back someone who's going to do that? If you concede that in 2020 it's going to be hard, what you're basically saying is we need to build a springboard for 2025. Now, how can you build a springboard for 2025 out of a candidate that you acknowledge will find it hard to hold together a parliamentary party?
Oh well, I don't think. I think if you get a leader like Corbyn that wins, and the PLP isn't supporting him, or he hasn't got, or they're struggling to. All that demonstrates to me is that the PLP is out of sync with its members and its support, and that it's them that needs to make the change and not the voters. I know it might be a bit idealistic.
But why should they change? Because to flip that around, nobody said that Corbyn had to change in kind of 97 to 2007. So why should they change now?
Well, put it a different way. I'm not necessarily saying that they should agree. I think that if you have, I think with the whole voting against the whip thing, the majority of the time in his career he has voted with the whip.
Yeah, but he has voted against it a lot more than most people ever will.
Of course he has, but if you look at the times when he has voted against them, I think most people struggle to go.
But I guess what I mean is, why is it now when people disagree with Corbyn an issue that people aren't following the kind of the leader's will, so to speak, and that they're not representative? Why is that now an issue? But when Corbyn was doing that, it was, well, he's a noble rebel. Why can't they be noble rebels in the opposite direction now?
That's true. I think it depends on why they're doing it. Because I don't think Corbyn ever voted against people just because he didn't like the leader, or just just for the sake of it. I think he voted against them for the right. So it depends. I think it comes down to why you're doing it. If you're rebelling against the whip of a Corbyn-led Labour just because, that's not an argument, in my opinion. But if you're doing it because you think genuinely that it's wrong, or it goes against what you believe in, or whatever, I think a Corbyn would be a hypocrite to go against that.
But what do you think? What do you think? So, what in your eyes is the solution if people are consistently kind of not, within the Parliamentary Labour Party, are not following what Corbyn wants?
Well, yeah, I've got no idea.
Because what I fear, Robbie, is that even though they say unity is our watchword and nothing is going to change, once you catch the leadership, you catch a lot of the mechanics of a party, and if you catch the leadership, you'll end up catching the kind of NEC, National Executive Committee. And then even though they've said they don't want to push deselection of candidates, I think when you get into the ground war of people rebelling against Corbyn openly, I can see this kind of far more left activist-based Labour has now than it ever had before. And it'll get more further left if Corbyn wins, kind of really pushing to deselect MPs who disagree with Corbyn. And I just don't see how that's palatable or long-term successful position for the Labour Party to be in.
Maybe not. I don't know, but I certainly don't think that I think that because Corbyn has remained in the Labour Party for so long, and I think that demonstrates a quite big amount of loyalty, then I don't think it's gonna. Basically, it would if the Labour Party wants to win, whatever damage anybody thinks Corbyn is going to do to the party, Labour MPs openly rebelling and trying to get rid of him, or kind of weaken his position, is going to cause way more damage than anybody can dream in their head that he could. I think that's an important thing to realise. And also, if he does win, he hasn't got any interest in just like saying this is what we're going to do. He's not going to. It won't be anywhere. The manifesto of Labour won't be anywhere near as left wing as what he's saying now. There would be a lot of compromise. Tom Watson is probably going to be his deputy leader, and he's not as left wing as Corbyn. I think that you might be surprised by the kind of what Labour puts forward once the dust settles. I don't think it would be as left wing as maybe we're imagining in our heads at the moment.
I don't know. It's going to be quite a few clicks left wing than they've been recently.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I don't think that's a bad thing in a lot of areas. I think again, it's not an advantage of him over, say, Ed Miliband. Miliband was left wing, but he was almost apologising for it the whole time. Natalie Bennett did the same thing for the Green Party, where it was like, yeah, we're different, but sorry, please don't be too mean. Whereas Farage was different in a way I'm not, but he definitely wasn't apologising for it, and that was one of his strengths.
Well, she was pretty terrible though, wasn't she, Natalie Bennett?
Oh yeah, God yeah. Only very ingrained Green supporter. A lot of the Green Party don't say much for his leader. When I was a Green Party supporter, I certainly was like, couldn't have chosen somebody worse, really. I'm sure she's a lovely person, but that doesn't mean she's good to lead a political party. What
do you think about people who've been recently kicked out of Labour or not allowed to vote?
Oh yeah, I think that Labour has spent what it to me what obviously is that Corbyn's winning comfortably, and there's an attempt to almost kind of undermine the legitimacy of the win by saying, oh, loads of people are entering for malicious reasons to vote. I think most people that are involved in it, from what I can tell, are doing it because they genuinely want to vote. And I think that Labour, I've never seen a party so against people that wants to win an election, so against people getting involved in their party. I think that a lot of people I know personally have been stopped from voting for no reason, basically. People that have been involved in the Labour Party for 30 years. And I don't think voting for another party in 2015 means you shouldn't. They put forward, Harriet Harman at the start of the thing said we want people from other parties to get involved. You know, they came up with this system.
What about, Robbie? What about if someone stood for another party in 2015?
I'd say I'd agree that's probably the line where you would say you can't vote because obviously you oppose that party in an official election. And I think that'd probably be one where it's fair to say you can't vote in our election. But I don't think voting for, even campaigning for another party, you know.
Because there just seems to be a fair amount of people who, like, I don't know, stood as like a TUSC councillor or whatever, and now want to be a Labour kind of voter and or have become a £3 member. And I mean, I think what they're missing is they're just seeing the values bit, but it also said that you need to sign up to the values and aims of the Labour Party. And as if one of the aims of the Labour Party is to win power, they in very recent memory have stood against Labour winning power, haven't they? So they've stood against Labour's aims.
Yeah, well, like I said, I do agree. If you stood for a party, then you shouldn't be allowed. I think it's fair to dismiss and vote. But I think that stuff like people being on social media liking a certain party's page or being a part of the group.
Well, that's ridiculous, yeah.
And that has been a reason because some people have like looked at people and found that and said, oh, you know, flag them up or whatever. There's been a lot of people that have been unfairly purged from the party. So it depends why, but I'd say if you stood for election for another party, or if you're obviously doing it for nefarious reasons, then fair enough. But Labour does not need to have got rid of anywhere near the amount of people that have, and I think they look bad for it as well. But it's not reflective on them as a party.
No, I think that's fair enough. I think my dividing line is standing for another party. I think voting for another party shouldn't be a barrier to people. I think that's a bit unfair, to be honest.
Well, it's almost like you wouldn't stop somebody from joining your party if they used to be a member of the Conservatives, would you, or whatever? It's a very weird viewpoint of, you know, this is our party, stay away when you want to win people over. I don't understand it personally.
No, that's a fair and reasonable point. So, I mean, just to conclude, you sort of, to be honest, you sort of sounded less positive about Corbyn's ability to win than I thought you would actually.
No, you know, it's not a case of that. And it's also, I don't know how to say so that being used against me, but Labour has this obsession with winning 2020 that's not really grounded in reality of like how of the kind of conditions of the country at the moment and the border changes. And a lot of people say you can't win. You know, there's no point in having principles if you don't win power. But obviously, there's a balance. So there's no point in having power if you haven't got any principles, and there has to be a balance between the both. And I think the biggest disagreement with a lot of people is where do you strike that balance of your principles and of getting power. But I think what it comes down to is the other three candidates haven't really got anything to offer. You know, I don't think that they've got enough about them as people. I don't think they've put forward any particularly good policies. They don't really inspire anybody, and you can reflect that. Their supporters, you can reflect that by the way they spend more time talking about Corbyn than they do about their own candidates. So I think Corbyn's the best chance of Labour doing anything in 2020. But I think also he's good because he's changing the conversation a lot, and I think that's something that we've needed for a long time. To conclude,
that's fair enough. I mean, he's definitely changing the conversation.
Your conclusion now.
Well, I mean, my conclusion would be that I don't think, if you take socialism in its broadest sense, I don't think Corbyn has given a kind of compelling, kind of evidence-based example of why socialism is what our society would need or want. And I think, despite the inadequacies of the other candidates, I would liken it to if you're driving into a wall at 40 miles an hour, that doesn't mean you accelerate up to 80. And I feel that by voting for Corbyn, they are basically accelerating up to 80. They're going to massively divide their party. They're going to make it almost a figure of ridicule in the media. And I think a lot of people who are in working class communities are perhaps on some issues a lot more socially conservative than what I would say are at times a kind of, I'm not saying it's true, but can be stereotyped as a very middle class Guardian reading kind of backers of Corbyn. And I just feel that what I feel is happening is people have looked into the past. They've seen the way, they've kind of seen that kind of spirit of 45 thing. They've seen the struggles that people had in the 80s. And they thought, you know what? We've had to deal with Blair for kind of 10 or 15 years. I want a bit of poetry in my politics, and I want to feel like I'm in a movement. And I think that kind of that kind of emotive thing of I want to feel like I'm campaigning is overtaking thinking, how are we going to get back into government to actually help people? So I don't know. I'm still massively unconvinced that this is something which is going to lead to something. I think it's going to make a lot of noise in a lot of campaign halls, and I think Corbyn's always going to get a lot of more people to rally around him. But when it comes to the broader electorate, I feel the far left is just going to turn on in 2020 and think, well, we haven't won again.
Ah, fair enough. I guess we'll find out in 2020 and in September.
And I guess in 2020, Robbie, if he doesn't win, are you going to go, well, people don't want socialism?
That would depend on a lot of factors. I won't want to make any statement here that could be.
Oh, because what I think is going to happen, I used to think, perhaps the hard left will say, right, people don't want this. But what I think is going to happen is I think two things are going to happen. I think they're going to go, well, we would have won, but the media are terrible. And then the second thing they're going to do is go, well, we would have won if the rest of the party would have really pulled their weight and got behind Corbyn. So I think there's almost going to be a stab in the back mentality. And I think whatever reality suggests or whatever the electorate suggests, these people will think we'd have won if only this had happened.
Yeah, maybe, but I think that's something that's probably not confined to the left.
True.
I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with if you have a view of the world that you want, just because you didn't win, to sort of stop fighting for that. I don't think that's
But it's a representative democracy, isn't it? So you've got to want to round off the edges of what you think, haven't you?
Yeah, of course. But I mean, a big part of politics, which isn't touched on much, is that it's not necessarily. I think a lot of the politics at the moment is following what people believe the electorate thinks, as opposed to trying to convert. I'm not saying it's an easy task at all, but as opposed to being like, hey, this is what I believe and I want to do, and this is why this is the best way of doing things. So that there's far too much following going on now, and I think.
But isn't that what kind of groups like UK and Cut are for? Isn't that their utility? It's not the Parliamentary Labour Party's utility. That's to govern.
I've no idea. I think that depends on who you ask.
Fair enough. Robert, I think we've covered loads there. We've gone on for absolutely ages.
We have. I know. I need to have dinner. I just looked at the time.
Sorry, mate. I do apologise.
No,
I wanted to try this as a kind of long form thing and see how it goes. I mean, if you want to do it again, but not necessarily wrap it on for 2 hours plus, then I'm more than happy to do so on any issue if you want to.
Yeah, that'd be great. I definitely want to do it again. Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. Don't get me wrong. I just can't believe how quick the time went. That was all.
No, it's good. I've really enjoyed it. I think you made some very interesting points, and I think we're probably going to end up discussing this again in a few months, to be honest.
Probably, yeah. I think that. I mean, I do actually think that based on the polls that we've seen in that, I do think Corbyn will win, just because I think it got a bit too late. I think Cooper has got some momentum, but it's come a bit too late.
Yep.
But I have no idea what's going to happen after, and I don't think anybody knows what will happen after this. That's anyone's guess. Definitely.
No, that's a good point. Well, I mean, thanks for coming on. I don't know how many people have actually watched. I can imagine it's very, very few. But if anyone does watch this in the future and has any questions, then I'll put my Twitter account or Robbie's Twitter account in the information feed, and feel free to ask questions on YouTube or ask us. I mean, we like a conversation, don't we? Well, evidently from this.
Clearly. Well, thanks for the chat, Sam, and I'm going to have my dinner, and you enjoy whatever you're going to do now.
Cheers again, mate. All the best.
Yeah, cheers, man. See you later.
Bye.